A folded invitation lay between Marcus Hale's fingers like a dare, and he had memorized its creases before he knew who had sent it. A headline that afternoon had pasted of champagne and cruelty, a photograph of Vivienne Carlisle smiling under chandeliers, and a town that loved to watch people fall. Before the story began, comment where you're watching from. Vivienne Carlisle, a billionaire socialite with a reputation for wagers and wicked good looks, had called it a joke and an experiment, but Marcus felt the weight of that invitation as if it were a sentence. The card said simply, "You are invited." He thought of the cardboard shelters, of the rain that smelled like metal on his face last winter, and he laughed once, a small, bitter sound that no one in the townhouse neighborhood heard. He was poor by every measurable standard, yet proud in the ways that mattered to him. This was how it started. He turned the invitation over and found a return address he did not expect. Now, follow what happened. Marcus stood at the corner of 5th and Rowan where the luxury limousines blinked their LED halos and delivery men folded suits into plastic. The air smelled of oil and roses, sharp and faintly sickening when the wind came off the river. He had been there because someone had left a box near the newspaper stand with a note that read, "If you accept, you will be welcomed." It felt like a lie until a valet in a pressed jacket spoke to him with practiced patience. The valet said, "You cannot enter, sir. This is private." Marcus looked at his own hands, the calluses from odd jobs, the scar by his thumb from a closed door in a shelter. He answered, "I am invited." And the valet hesitated, fingers tight on brass. Marcus did not beg. He tilted his chin and waited. The city hummed, a bass line of tires and distant laughter. The crowd smelled of perfume and hot buttered canapes. People glanced and pointed, their eyes like small verdicts. Marcus said to himself, "Is this the moment you choose to be seen?" She had promised to watch. Sophia Martinez from the salon had found him first. The salon windows were glass and light, smelling of lacquer and citrus, hairpins like armor on the counter. Sophia wiped her hands on a towel when she saw Marcus, and her face softened into surprise, then determination. She spoke quickly, practical. "We will make you presentable." Marcus felt the scent of hairspray and mint as she handed him a sweater that was clean, the fabric soft against the rasp of his wrist. She introduced him to Amelia Ross, who lent a tie, and to Connor Reed, who offered to photograph for free. The street outside breathed differently as they moved. The sound of subway trains beneath their feet was a low constant, and the city tasted like copper and expectation. Marcus tried on clothes as if trying on someone else's life and found the fit slightly awkward but not impossible. Sophia said, "You will walk in like you belong," and Marcus repeated, "Like I belong," and the phrase settled in his chest like a small coin. They joked to ease the tension, voices overlapping. Sophia teased, "Where do you keep your crown, Marcus?" and he laughed until his ribs ached. The transformation felt less like an act and more like a reclamation. The salon sequence was long and deliberate. Makeup brushes whispered across skin, rouge warmed the cheeks, foundation smoothed the lines carved by sleeping on benches. The hot hum of hairdryers sounded like a distant engine, and the mirror reflected a man who had not been reflected in such light in years. A stylist spoke softly about the cut, in tones whispering like a confidant. Someone handed him a cup of coffee that tasted too bitter, and then better, as he warmed it with his hands. Conversation stitched together. Sophia asked about his story. Amelia pressed with sisterly tenderness. Connor made notes about angles and the way light softened a jawline. Dialogues deepened the minutes. "When did you stop dreaming, Marcus?" asked Sophia gently. And Marcus told about his mother humming lullabies into broom closet nights, about the first time he stole an apple for a neighbor child, about the job that ended with a company bankruptcy and a landlord who would not wait. Each answer widened the mirror, and the city noise outside became a distant ocean surge. The sensory details came rapid. The perfume on a passing woman was too sweet. The rust of a nearby fire escape smelled of old coins. The taste of wax from a candle in the dressing room made him think of old churches. He listened to voices and felt the weight of soft fabric and a small new dignity he had not expected to accept. The night of the event held a fragile electric expectation. The mansion doorway was lit by sconces. The marble steps shone under polished shoes. A pianist played a slow piece inside that throbbed against the chest in a way that felt like confession. Marcus followed Vivienne across rooms that smelled of lemon oil and expensive tobacco. Her dress was a blade of satin light that reflected the chandeliers, and she spoke to guests with the ease of a practiced queen. At the entrance she paused and laughed with a noise like the clinking of crystal. Marcus felt his pulse in the hollows of his throat. She, Vivienne, said in a voice that was both an invitation and a command, "Would you present him?" He adjusted the tie that Amelia had insisted on knotting properly and answered, "Yes, if you wish," and the exchange rippled outward. Their conversation held a dozen small cutting barbs that the crowd absorbed with appetite. Someone in the room clocked a smirk, and the cameras tilted as if sensing the scent of drama. The lights hit the red carpet, and 100 bodies leaned into the moment. Vivienne introduced him as an experiment, a social proof of chance and whimsy, and laughter tucked into the edges of the proclamation like a knife. Marcus took in the room through a catalog of senses. The chandeliers hissed with a wet ring of light. The floor was cool under his shoes. Champagne tasted metallic, then sweet. The murmured voices blended into a wash of gossip and thin jokes. He watched Vivienne and the former fiancé of hers, Henry Cole, a man with a jaw that could cut cheese, exchange a look that smelled of calculation. The narrator in Marcus' chest asked, "Why are you here?" And he answered, "Because I was invited, and because something in him wanted to see what would happen when a man like him stood under a canopy meant for a different class." People commented in clipped sentences. A woman near the buffet observed, "She looks like she is making a statement." And another said, "Maybe it is charity or a new kind of sport." Marcus heard the words, but he also felt the hands of strangers brush his sleeve differently, as if they wanted to measure the fabric of his being. The first tension rose like a storm. He remembered a winter when his teeth had chattered through holes in his shoes and someone had turned away, and the memory hardened into resolve. The crowd leaned, the lights angled, and the first cliffhanger emerged when Vivienne dropped one sentence that hung heavy in the air. "You are invited to stay for the little ceremony," she said, and the room inhaled. The promise of spectacle tightened like a string. The transformation portion closed with applause that felt like an interrogation. Marcus, newly presented, walked with a steadiness he had borrowed. Cameras blinked. There was a pause, a micro-teasing of future exposition. If you are feeling this mix of surprise and anger, you are not alone. What would you do in his place? Write your city and the word chocolate in the comments to show you reached this moment. Your comment helps others find this story and join the conversation about justice and empathy. Now that you commented, let us continue to see what happened next. The CTA lingered like an echo, and the narrative advanced. Voices in the crowd nudged the mood toward entertainment or outrage, depending on whose whispers reached the nearest microphones. The event, in that moment, felt like a stage for history to pick a favorite. Backstory arrived in quiet rooms and whispered phone calls. Marcus had grown up in a modest 3-bedroom in a neighborhood that had once been full of factories. His mother worked 2 shifts and hummed lullabies in a voice that smelled of boiled laundry and cinnamon. As a child, Marcus had loved machines. He would disassemble a clock just to see the gears sleep and learn patience when he had to put them back together. School had been a place he visited without staying long because bills whispered through the house like a persistent wind. He worked his first job at a bakery at 14 and got his hands dough-sticky and warm, tasting sugar on his fingers long after he left. Loss had been patient. When his mother died of a sudden blood clot, he learned the economy of grief, and the small rituals of survival. Years later, a company that promised stability collapsed overnight, and Marcus watched coworkers fold like paper. He refused to be bitter, but he developed a carefulness that made him practical and shy with trust. He kept one dog-eared book, a draft of a story about a man who fixed clocks in a city that forgot time. Marcus had simple tastes, a sympathy for people on the margins, and a stubborn belief that dignity could be found in any set of clothes when worn with honesty. This backstory was not dramatic in the tabloids' ways, but it grounded him. He knew the texture of hunger and the price of staying invisible, and that knowledge would shape each decision he made that night. Vivienne Carlisle's background resembled a glossy magazine profile when read quickly, but was jagged on closer inspection. Born into money and increasingly hardened by the world of high-stakes deals, she had learned early to mask discomfort with smiles that glinted like coins. Schooling in private academies taught her to wield conversation like a blade and to treat trouble like a maintenance issue. She had a father who built businesses with risk appetite and a mother who collected elegant friends as if curating art. Vivienne loved tests and found humans interesting specimens. She had once been engaged to Henry Cole in a match that read like a boardroom merger, a promise of shared power until small insults had inflated into scalding resentments. She treated charity as theater and wagers as hobbies. The marriage she proposed to Marcus was, in her view, a social experiment, to watch how a man from outside her world would collapse or perform under pressure. There were stories of her edge. She had engineered corporate humiliations, launched viral social campaigns, and laughed as reputations frayed. She believed herself invulnerable until a sequence of miscalculations involving a ledger and a trust would reveal cracks in both morality and fortune. Her backstory had helped her construct a throne, but not the empathy to hold anyone on it. The investigation began as rumor and then folded into evidence. Connor Reed, the young journalist, started collecting names and dates, fingers stained with coffee and an eagerness that smelled of late nights and ambition. He called Detective Leila Moreno, who had patience in the shape of a ledger, someone comfortable with small truths that add up to large crimes. They traced bank transfers, read through receipts, and noticed a pattern of philanthropic funds redirected through shell companies. A technical description of the investigative process explained how subpoena powers worked. Investigators requested bank statements and digital metadata traced IP addresses and established timelines. The process required forensic accounting, where entries were reconciled, suspicious transactions flagged, and emails subpoenaed for context. The legal team prepared affidavits and coordinated with the district attorney to ensure evidence was admissible in court. This procedural core, described plainly, suggested complexity but also clarity. The phone calls multiplied. There were late-night meetings in cafes where the smell of espresso cut through fatigue and the tapping of keyboards as documents moved like secret traffic. The tension tightened as the team realized Vivienne had not only staged a social experiment, but possibly misappropriated funds and manipulated investors. This revelation recontextualized the marriage from a cruel stunt to a possible mechanism of fraud. Dialogues in the office scenes grew barbed and urgent. Marcus sat across from Detective Moreno in a room that smelled of recycled air and old coffee. She asked him what he remembered, and he recited the night like a ledger, noting the jokes, the offhand comments, the envelopes slipped beneath napkins. He had watched people in suits whisper and had overheard the name of a foundation that did not appear on any registry. Lila asked how the invitation had been delivered, and he described the folded cardboard with a breath that shook when he named her. He kept details precise as if every fact was a brick. Meanwhile, Connor argued with his editor on the phone, insisting on corroboration and exact quotes. Amelia Ross and Sophia Martinez gave statements about hair appointments and timings, and a pattern began to form. Vivienne received a polite letter requesting voluntary cooperation, which she flung aside with a laugh, untroubled. Henry Cole counseled her to keep illusions. His voice to her was soft and measured and a little exasperated. Vivienne responded with a cutting grin. "We are storytellers, Henry, and he is merely a prop." The words would later recoil like a thrown stone. The escalation came in the form of headlines. A tabloid published a photo of Vivienne lifting Marcus into a mock bridal pose, and the caption read, "Millionairess marries a poor man for fun." That phrase ricocheted through social feeds, and the town smelled of outrage that had the shape of televised outrage must be fed. Social media multiplied versions of the story, some savage, some sympathetic, each share a splinter. Protesters gathered at the mansion, chanting and waving placards that smelled of spray paint and damp cardboard. A rival socialite, Elena Price, posted a cutting commentary that tasted like lemon and sent her followers into a frenzy. Marcus felt the attention like a wind that either might warm him or break him. He received messages that were both helpful and harassing. Some offered support and sheltering words, while others were cruel as stones. The company that had once employed him surfaced with a statement of support for a charity he had never heard of. Marcus, who had entered with blunt curiosity, found himself pressed into corralling.
Choices. He consulted with Amelia and Sophia and Connor and Detective Moreno. They debated a plan that would reclaim dignity without becoming a spectacle of vengeance. The moment of tension resolved around a decision to collect evidence and present it publicly with legal counsel in a way that would do more than humiliate. It would aim to restore what had been taken. An elaborate trap formed around a charity gala set by Vivienne to celebrate what she called her philanthropic awakening. They arranged to use the event as a stage to reveal truths. Marcus knew the stakes. He walked into the room with conviction and a quiet that felt heavier than the applause. The steak knives of conversation were replaced by silverware and polite laughter. Over the course of the evening, he moved between tables and couches, exchanging lines with 12 people who would later be named in reports. He told a young woman named Elena that people should not be used for sport, and she scoffed. "You are melodramatic." And he replied, "Perhaps, but I am still human." He debated gently with Henry Cole, who suggested the whole thing was harmless, and Henry said, "Play along and you will be rewarded," to which Marcus replied, "Reward does not mean humiliation." The exchange continued, and cameras collected their faces like insects in amber. Detective Moreno had arranged for legal counsel to present documents at a precise moment. Connor sent a message like a bell, and a video flickered on screens around the room. A dossier appeared on a table, glossy and neat, spelling out transactions that linked supposed charitable disbursements to shell accounts, to an offshore consultancy, to payments made to Vivienne's art auctions that never existed. People murmured. The air tasted of metal and citrus, and Vivienne laughed at first, a fragile sound. The exposure was methodical. The legal team presented a timeline, receipts, audio clips, and bank verifications. There was a procedural explanation given in plain language showing how the funds were diverted, how authorization signatures were forged, and how documentation was shredded and replaced. The account of technical forensic accounting described reconciliations and tracing of electronic signatures across jurisdictions. The lawyers spoke clearly about charges that could include embezzlement and breach of fiduciary duty. And the district attorney, a man named Benjamin Hayes, who had been briefed by Detective Moreno, announced that arrests could follow. Vivienne tried to regain control by denouncing accusers as petty and jealous, but the press circled like crows. Her voice slipped from confident piano into a tremulous tremor when confronted with a documentary chain of evidence that would stand up in court. The room felt suddenly small. Vivienne attempted to reclaim the narrative with a practiced smirk and a cutting remark aimed at Marcus. "You should be grateful you were chosen to be my muse," which fell flat. The crowd began to murmur in a tone that was no longer entertainment. Some guests stood and left, the soles of their shoes brushing marble like a soft punctuation. There was the sound of glasses setting into saucers, and the tap of a woman's high heel against stone as she walked away. The arrest had a public force that felt like the closing of a book. Uniformed officers arrived with courtroom authority, papers that smelled of printer ink and the rustle of rights being read. Vivienne was told she had the right to remain silent, and the sound of that phrase made something crack inside the room. She had been the orchestrator of countless frames, and now she stood framed herself. Cameras rolled, flash like a jury. She protested loudly at first, The protest a mixture of indignation and disbelief. Henry Cole stood by, his face an even mask, while Elena Price called a lawyer, and Connor recorded every moment. Detective Moreno handled the process with clinical care, reading charges that included misappropriation and fraud. The pocket of tension that had held the night together released into shock. People who had come for spectacle found themselves in a courtroom drama. Marcus listened to the rights and felt a complex swirl of relief and sorrow. He had not wanted to destroy anyone. He had wanted truth. Justice, arriving in handcuffs and procedure, felt both lighter and heavier than he had imagined. The arrest became a dividing line in the social history of that town. The consequences rippled. Investors withdrew money from ventures tied to Vivienne, and a boardroom that had once bowed to her ideas now demanded audits. Her philanthropic partners issued statements of regret. The tabloids printed quotable fragments and editorialized with predictable relish. Marcus found his name on trend lists, a sensation that tasted oddly like grief and hope mixed. He returned to his modest room and found it felt different, though nothing had changed. The air seemed brighter. People brought gifts, not of pity, but of practical help. Sophia set up a crowdfunding page for Marcus to build a small repair shop that could pay decent wages to his friends and to others who needed honest work. Amelia pushed for a modest loan, and Connor connected him with a community program that taught business basics and bookkeeping. The first steps to repair happened in slow increments. Permits, a lease signed at a plain office where the smell of paper and toner marked new beginnings. The sound of hammers and the greasy taste of concrete dust. The story on television spoke of poetic justice. Marcus, who had always fixed broken things, began to build something that would not be an ornament but a tool. A public reconciliation between Marcus and the world did not come easily. He had to navigate interviews where anchors asked direct questions, sometimes cruel, sometimes awkward, and he had to refuse becoming a perpetual spectacle. He felt gratitude for kindness, anger at the spectacle of his life, and confusion at the speed of change once truth loosened its first stone. He and Vivienne crossed in courtrooms and hallways. With a new body of witnesses and shared legal counsel had their lines drawn. Vivienne sought to rebuild public favor with statements about misunderstanding and personal growth. She appeared in staged photographs with medical charities and tried to host panels where she spoke about empowerment. The public was skeptical. Her attempts at repair read like costume changes. Marcus chose a quieter path. He opened a small consultancy he called Hale Repairs, where he taught trades and offered apprenticeships. He partnered with Sophia and Connor to ensure marketing and bookkeeping were solid. He repaired clocks and souls in equal measure. The business grew slowly, fed by referrals and the small dignity of work well done. People who had once watched him with suspicion now knocked on his door for honest help. Love grew in unexpected places. Romance arrived not as fireworks, but as a steady lamp. Amelia Ross, who had been Marcus's anchor, found her own life entwined with his in the way of seasons, patient and inevitable. They shared rituals of tea on Sundays and the small domestic jokes of people who understand poverty and know the price of kindness. Their dialogues were intimate and numerous, a display of 10 to 12 exchanges that charted the minutiae of living together. Amelia teased Marcus about misplacing the coffee grounds, and he responded by hiding her pen that she called invaluable. They debated paint colors for the shop and how to allocate profits for community classes. Their touch was practical. She bandaged his thumb after a small injury, and he learned to make her laugh in the early mornings. Intimacy grew in tactile details, in the smell of bread baking on a weekday, in the warmth of shared bedsheets on cold nights. Marcus remained wary of spectacle. He guarded their privacy like a treasured tool. He proposed to Amelia in a modest way in the back of the workshop under the soft spill of fluorescent light, speaking of partnership and work and a life built by hand. Amelia said yes, and the acceptance was not a social media event, but a small, private ceremony with friends who had been there from the start. The reconstruction of social life extended beyond romance. Marcus established Hale Consultations as a community-centered business that offered financial literacy and vocational training.
He partnered with legal aid through Detective Moreno's connections and offered apprenticeship programs for young people who had limited options. Sophia continued to run her salon and offered scholarships for apprentices. Connor produced a documentary focusing on resilient people rather than spectacle. The shop on Rowan Street donated time to repair essential devices for elderly neighbors, and ARC Charity offered startup microloans. People named in public later offered apologies and some private donations to the new initiatives. The public conversation shifted gradually from spectacle to systemic questions about how wealth can be weaponized and how transparency can be enforced. The City Council convened a panel on philanthropic accountability, and Mayor Benjamin Hayes noted the need for clearer regulations on nonprofit governance. The legal discussion about fiduciary duty sparked policy revisions and a new emphasis on audit trails for charitable funds. There were moments of high tension that cut like a knife and lingered. One such moment occurred when a prominent donor attempted to withdraw support unless Marcus publicly forgave Vivienne in a televised special. Marcus sat in a dim room, the air smelling of stale popcorn from the TV, and his fingers tightened on a note that said, "Forgiveness is not for sale." He remembered his mother hum the lullaby about patience and finally replied, "No, we will not bargain morality for airtime." The exchange with the donor, captured in a series of questions and replies, lasted long enough to feel like a small trial. Another moment occurred when a smear campaign tried to paint Marcus as an opportunist, producing doctored images and phrases cut from context. He felt the rush of betrayal in his chest and had to remind himself of facts and records and to answer with documents rather than anger. The legal team prepared counterclaims, and a small victory in court restored both reputation and a sense of procedural right. A third intense moment surfaced when a beloved apprentice nearly lost his job because of a bureaucratic glitch. Marcus slept badly and paced the morning with the metallic taste of worry on his tongue until he fixed the problem himself. Each tension had internal decisions, memories of scarcity, and choices that would define character rather than spectacle. These moments made the arc credible. In court, the procedural technicalities were exacting and explained. Forensic accountants presented reconciliations showing diverted lines of credit moving through accounts. And the attorney for the prosecution discussed chain of custody protocols to ensure evidence would not be dismissed. Digital forensic specialists described how metadata linked emails to specific devices and IP addresses, and how deleted files were recovered from backup servers. The description of these processes was concise and accessible, noting that subpoenas required probable cause and that warrants were obtained through showing of probable manipulation. These passages, while technical, were intended as transparent windows into how white-collar crime becomes visible. The judge reviewed affidavits and set bail, and Vivienne's legal team attempted to negotiate. The accumulated facts suffocated the defense lines. Newspapers printed the forensic diagrams, and the public read them like maps of betrayal. The fall of Vivienne was public and unglamorous. Money managers resigned, her brand deals evaporated, and the charity boards cut ties. She faced trial and, in media appearances, tried to rebrand herself as a woman who had made mistakes. Spectators who had once toasted her began to avoid her gaze. There was no single dramatic arrest scene that solved everything, but a series of legal defeats that tightened like a trap. Marcus observed the decline without rejoicing. He recognized the complexity of human ruin. He had wanted truth, not vengeance, and so he refused to let satisfaction become the only lens. He accepted a modest apology that was partly performative and partly sincere. Vivienne, once a tempest of control, had lost the instruments of control. The consequences carried weight. She lost assets in settlements and was barred from holding feudatory roles for years. She undertook community service and spoke at panels about the dangers of treating people as props. Her public statements were measured and sometimes sincere, other times they seemed rehearsed. The world turned, slow and precise. Reconstruction became a daily labor for Marcus and his circle. The shop prospered, slowly and with care. Apprentices learned trades and the language of ledgers. There were domestic scenes, full of dialogue, where Marcus and Amelia negotiated everyday life with tenderness and occasional friction. Friends like Sophia and Connor became more than allies. They became family, in the sense people choose to be family when blood is not the only glue. Harmony arrived in small increments: a repaired clock that chimed on time, a child learning to weld, a teenage apprentice receiving a scholarship. There was laughter over burnt toast, and disagreements about how to allocate profits. Marcus sometimes worried that the city had only turned attention for a moment, and that systems that created disparity remained intact. He used his platform to advocate for policy changes, to appear before panels and testify about the ways that spectacle obscures structural injustice. An epilogue showed the unfolding life in 3 timed moments. 1 month later, the shop celebrated a modest opening party with soup and warm bread, the smell of yeast and onions filling the little space. The crowd included neighbors and reporters who wrote profiles that focused on community building rather than scandal. Marcus spoke briefly about repair and dignity, and his voice shook only with gratitude. He had a ledger of clients and a schedule that smelled of solvent and oil, and he slept better. His smile when he closed the shop was private and honest. 3 months later, Marcus had hired 4 apprentices, and the consultancy offered free workshops for young people. The municipal program that Detective Moreno helped create was in pilot and showed promising metrics. Vivienne had begun community service and made a public donation to a foundation she had once exploited. The gesture was suspicious to some, but helpful to others, as it funded technical training. Marcus and Amelia celebrated a quiet engagement party with friends who had been steadfast. The evening tasted of roasted vegetables and laughter that did not echo with irony. 6 months later, the shop had a waiting list. Hale Consultations had a small grant that allowed it to expand classes, and the city council passed a measure to require clearer reporting for charitable foundations. Marcus and Amelia were expecting their first child, and the news lit a gentle glow across their small kitchen, where the smell of coffee and baby formula notes mixed with plans for a future that looked less precarious. The final scene showed Marcus writing a simple ledger entry and kissing Amelia on the forehead as they looked at the sun through a dusty window. The narrative closed with a feeling of hard-won peace and a resonant promise that the world could be changed by truth and care. There were characters who moved like gears in the story and who deserved names and small actions. Vivienne Carlisle was the catalyst and villain who learned a costly lesson. Marcus Hale was the central figure whose dignity provided the spine of the tale. Detective Lila Moreno traced financial footprints and ensured the law worked as it should. Connor Reed was a journalist who documented moments with care and tenacity. Sophia Martinez offered transformation and sanctuary in the salon. Amelia Ross provided love, steadiness, and the practical carpentry that built a home. Henry Cole was the socialite with a veneer of support who later receded. Elena Price, a rival social figure, stirred public opinion and helped escalate the scandal. Mayor Benjamin Hayes oversaw policy changes and provided a public forum where reform could be debated. Each named person performed tasks that moved the plot from spectacle to accountability. 3 moments of peak tension remained etched in the community memory. The first occurred during the gala when the dossier was revealed and the cameras caught Vivienne's mask crack. The crowd had leaned in, breaths short, the hum of expensive garments and the sour smell of fear filling the room. Heartbeats synchronized with the click of shutters. The second high moment was the courtroom day when testimony revealed offshore transfers. Witnesses paced the stand, and Marcus felt the old hunger of need confronted by new facts. The air in the courtroom tasted like rubber and ink. The third critical pressure point came as Marcus contemplated a generous settlement conditioned on silence, and watched the town's moral compass wobble as donors weighed their decisions. He refused the silent pact and instead chose truth, a decision that cost him potential comfort but preserved integrity. Each of these moments featured internal conflict, memory recall, and a decision that pivoted the narrative toward moral restoration.
The final formalities included technical descriptions of evidence handling and the legal resolution. Forensic accountants prepared reconciliations with independent auditors providing verification. Chain of custody logs listed dates, times, and signatories. Subpoenas required precise wording and were served according to court rules. Digital forensics extracted metadata and preserved backups to keep data admissible. The district attorney filed charges after consultation with investigators and presented the case with a focus on fiduciary violations and embezzlement where appropriate. These descriptions were concise but accurate enough to illustrate that legal consequences were neither arbitrary nor theatrical, but grounded in municipal process. By the end, the world had shifted modestly but meaningfully. Vivienne faced consequences, Marcus built a life, and the community gained policy changes that would lessen the chance of similar spectacles. The story concluded with a sense that justice had been slow but deliberate. If you felt this narrative stir, something inside you share where you watched from and the word chocolate in the comments. Subscribe if you want more stories about truth, accountability, and second chances. In a city built on facades, the most radical act remained simple kindness and unwavering honesty.